top of the morning. Top of the morning, top of the morning, top of the morning, top. Hello there, welcome to Dev Brew. This is where indie game developers send their games and I do my best to give feedback on their game design. Today we're looking at a game called o-CoO, or o-CoO. o-CoO is this game that was submitted. Who submitted this game? This game was submitted by this name and was developed by Breadfast Tea, and I believe Mr. Chocolate Salmon. If you are not this person and you want to submit a game, you can do so. You can find that in the link in the description along with the Discords. There's a bunch of developers there and we can talk about game design, which is just like the most boring topic ever, but I love it. And you must too if you're watching this. I've got my cup warmer. Freaking brain is working today. That's pretty crazy, right? So what is o-CoO? o-CoO is this game that was made for a game jam. The theme of the game jam was called Connections, and I can't remember what the game jam itself was called. You have a pendulum that swings in a circle, and I'll just show you. So you have this pendulum that swings in a circle, and you have to move the pivot point for it to capture those little orange dots. So that's what this is all about. And then what happens is basically a bunch of these pendulums show up, and you have to keep away from these little red spikes that come up. The goal of the game is to get to, wow, oh geez, this is weird. My cursor. I'm using my cursor in the gameplay, but I'm also using my cursor to draw here, so that's freaking me out. You can see these guys. These are these pendulums that you're moving. You're constantly moving these pendulums. Then you got to keep away from these little red spikes. So if we go over here, we can see there's these little red explodey spikes that you can see. You can see right here, little red explodey spike. And what happens is that a bunch of those spawn. It's your job to avoid them while trying to capture those little orange dots with your pendulum, as you can see right there. So that's what this game is. It's a pretty simple game, as you know, game jam games usually are. They're pretty simple. It had me wondering something specific, and it was, what is it about this game that I get a lack of purpose from? And it's not so much a lack of purpose. I don't want to say it that way because it makes it sound like I'm dogging on the game. It feels like a game jam game, and the reason why that is because after playing the game for some time, you start to figure out there's a bit of a ceiling. Some things start not working together. So let's look at why that's happening. So the game is about swinging pendulums, and the pendulums don't swing like back and forth, they swing in a circle. And the idea is to move these pendulums so that the pendulum itself comes in contact with these little pellets that appear. More tablets appear, and then more pendulums appear, and then you have to basically manage all of these pendulums while avoiding these little red spikes. So that's what it's about. It's about trying to keep as many pendulums going and collecting these tablets as long as possible. I saw this comment on their Game Jam page that said it feels relaxing and stressful at the same time. Relaxing because the music is super relaxing, and it kind of has this vibe since it has this minimalist, aesthetic going on, that it has like this kind of chill vibe to everything, but what you're actually doing is super stressful, right? Having to manage all these pendulums swinging everywhere. It can get, pretty stressful. The other thing that adds to the stress is the timing of stuff. So obviously this whole game is based on timing, but the enemies are based on reaction. So if you remember Geometry Wars, the entire point of the game, you have to keep moving and you have to keep shooting, otherwise you're gonna die. Everything is geared toward that one thing. What's happening here in this game, the reason why I brought up Geometry Wars, the enemies that spawn here, the way they attack is appearing in one spot and then they blow up. So the idea is if you have any pendulum that's near that randomly spawning red dot that's going to blow up, you have to move them before the thing explodes, which means it's a reaction-based enemy. It's an enemy that's basing its effectiveness of its attack on how fast the player can move. But that's not really what this game is about. And the mechanics of this game is not about how fast the player can move their pendulum around, but how smart they can be with moving their pendulum. And the reason why is because the amount of control that the player has here is not a whole lot. If you look at what the player is actually doing in the mechanics, they're trying to move the pendulum so that it has a very specific circle to it, a very specific shape, you could say. The pendulum itself kind of swings kind of at a varied speed, so the player doesn't really have control over the speed so much of the pendulum. They do a little bit. It moves kind of slower upward versus kind of faster downward. Although you can recognize that it's not really super apparent when you control it. So when the player is like moving their pendulums around, they don't really know how to do it like super fast. And yet the enemies, you know, need the player to move super fast. So that's where I got a little bit weird about the purpose of this whole thing, because I'm like, it seems like the enemies are made for almost a different game. I do like the idea of the game where it's kind of like this random amount of enemies that come in kind of make the situations unpredictable, which means that the player needs to, you know, survive as long as possible. But the survival technique is not really matching the survival mechanics, and it makes for kind of a weird feeling, a kind of a weird ceiling of the game. What I mean by ceiling is that there's a point in the game to where you have, you know, so many pendulums. Right here I have 6, and here comes the 7th one, and I'm moving them so that, you know, they are getting out of the way of these red spikes, and I have to collect these tablets, you know. So I'm being really smart about the way I'm moving them, but as you can see, I just lost a pendulum because I couldn't move it in time. And of course I wasn't paying attention a whole lot right there, but right there, for example, is one that I did react in time with, but I can't really do it any faster. So it really feels like that's a ceiling in the game. Like that's just a place that you have to accept defeat. It doesn't seem like that's fair because again, the player isn't in control of their reaction. It's not, they're not controlling the effective speed of moving the pendulums themselves. So it feels a bit weird. It feels a bit like the game wasn't designed to have those kinds of enemies in it, which is why I say it feels like a game jam game, because game jam games are usually created for the purpose of having a game that effectively tells the theme. It's a really good visual encapsulation of what the theme is, which is connections, right? And this pendulum thing is really interesting to see play out, but as a set of mechanics and as all of them working together, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of depth to it. That's my view on the entire, you know, purpose of the game. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about specific design elements in the game. So the very first element that popped out to me was the intro screen. And the intro screen is interesting because it's showing the player exactly what to do. You have a little arrow that pops up here and it says click and drag, right? So you click and drag and then this pendulum swings. When you first see what's happening here, what's in front of the screen, there's nothing that pops out to you. They don't have any inherent meaning to them. So what we see here is a dot, a dot, a dot, and a dot. And we're trying to figure out what is the relationship between these 4 dots, and there's none to us right now. So when we click and drag from the bigger dot to the gray dot, and then this thing swings, then we've created some sort of mechanic, and we understand right there that we've created a pendulum that swings. However, we don't know what this thing is, and we don't know what that thing is, or actually to any of these things, honestly. This is important. The relationship between this one and that one is important because this was the original pivot point. And what we're doing is we're moving the pivot point from here to there. And we don't know that we're doing that when we do it. And unfortunately, that is necessary for us to move forward, to us to understand what the entire game is about. I saw some of the comments down in the Game Jam comment section where people were saying, a lot of people were saying that they had a hard time kind of understanding what the point was from the very beginning. And I think this is a great way to start your game, to show the mechanic immediately right there in front of you. But if the player doesn't know exactly what they're doing with all these things, you have to have a way to let them know what each of these things are doing. In order to do that, it seems like this mechanic is actually a bit more complex. I like the idea of what's happening here. I don't think it works because the mechanic, like I said, is a bit more complex than this simple thing would show. So when you start the game, then we got a little tutorial screen that pops up. I think this is well intentioned. First, we have really good separation with colors, which is great because everything's really well sectioned off. So the dots here, the little grid, you know, they're all a very small gray color, but at the same time, then we have this big yellow color that pops out really well. So I really like that. It's just really strong contrast. So you understand immediately there's separation here. However, The thing that's happening here, the relationship that we're being taught, again, isn't super clear. I think it's because it's building on the previous mechanic, because the mechanic that we learned in the intro screen. And because the mechanic that we learned in the intro screen, we didn't really understand the relationships between each of these things, it's kind of hard to understand what's happening here. So it says connect the dots to move around and eat the tablets. I like the description. I think the description's great. Connect the dots is something that we automatically understand, that we need to drag from one dot to another. That's cool. And then it says eat the tablets rather than like collect or hit. Eat is just something that people immediately understand in a video gamey kind of way, means to collect as many as possible. I thought that was nice. This is the original pivot point for the pendulum, and the pendulum swings in a circle. And we don't know any of those things yet. And so when it says click and drag, we have a tiny little arrow here, which again, this was taught in the intro, but not super effectively. We don't really know that clicking and dragging from here to here means that we're creating a new pivot point for the pendulum. And not only that, the whole first part of this game, I was clicking on this part, on the pivot point, because it made sense to me to create a new pivot point for the pendulum by clicking and moving the pivot point, rather than the pendulum itself, because then your relationship is weird, right? Otherwise it doesn't really make any sense logically to me. Say we have, a little pendulum that's swinging from here and goes from side to side. Then what I would want to do is take that, move it, and over here, and now the pendulum is swinging this way, right? I don't know if that was super clear. That's what I feel like is happening in my head. Physically, that's what I imagine is happening. So the logic there is kind of pre-built in my head. So when I see this kind of thing where I need to click on the pendulum itself, it's not connected with me immediately. So I need that explained. And I think the way I would explain it in here is just by showing an animation, because that's typically what you just need to do. I mean, like the mechanic is pretty complex in terms of relationships, but if you can show it, then it's pretty easy to understand. This is one of those things where show instead of do is actually pretty helpful in this regard. Like I said, it's a complex mechanic, so I think showing it would actually be easier to figure out, at least. Another thing is you'll see right here, I moved my cursor right there to the X, and I was like, oh. And the reason why I did that was because the X is there. So this X really seems like it's something that I need to click. Like, I mean, why else would it be there, right? This X here just really doesn't need to be here. I get what's happening here. Like, we're kind of recycling the in-game tutorial as the intro tutorial. But I think what needs to happen is during that intro, just take away that X. Like, we just don't need it. Just take that away to make the player flip through the cards and then understand the mechanic. And then once they've got all the cards flipped through, then they can close the tutorial. And then just don't show the tutorial, when the game restarts. It's just setting a flag is what needs to happen there. You might have players that skip the tutorial accidentally. Don't want that. The next slide is showing avoid red spikes. I think that's perfect. And then it says this, tablets aren't eaten will turn into red spikes, or it says read spikes, means red spikes. And this was a bit weird to me because I just learned that I need to avoid red spikes, and it says tablets that aren't eaten are turned into them. So I was like, oh, so that's the only time that I have red spikes is when tablets turn into them? No, turns out, red spikes do randomly spawn in addition to tablets not eaten will turn into red spikes also. I did not understand that. I need to understand first that red spikes are a thing that exists first, and then explain this thing. And that could just be as easy like in the description. It could say something like tablets that aren't eaten will turn into red spikes also. Like just having that also at the end would be like, oh, okay, those are two separate things, I get it. And then the one thing that I had trouble with was the way that these pendulums show your predictive circle. So you can see that when, this was the beginning of the game, so I kept clicking and dragging on the pivot point instead of the pendulum itself, which by the way, why can you click on the pivot point? I've noticed that you can't click on the line itself, but you can click the pivot or the pendulum. And I'm wondering why that is, because when I click and move on the pivot point, and you can see that when I do this, this line is drawn for me. Just watch this happen. So you can see that when I click and move the pivot point, I feel like the line should be going from the pivot point to the new pivot point, but instead there's a line drawn from the pendulum to the new pivot point. And it feels weird to do. So I would just take that away. Just don't let them click the pivot point, right? Only click the pendulum, and I think that would make it clear. You know, do not click the pivot point. So the other thing is these predictive lines here. So what I'm talking about is this this faint circle. It draws that whenever you move the pendulum. But weird thing about this, the pendulum constantly swings. Okay, so if you see what happens here, when I move the pendulum, if I click and hold, the pendulum keeps swinging, but the circle grows constantly, right? This kind of weird thing where the circle grows and then shrinks is just kind of strange to me, because I have to wait for the pendulum to move to the certain circle that I want in order to move it there. So I have a little bit less control over that. And it's weird because that's the main mechanic of the game. It feels like the mechanic doesn't work super well because of that. I think the player could retain the control pretty easily if, when they move the pendulum, if time slowed down, right? If it slowed down a little bit while they moved it, or if time just froze, that way they could see the arc that they're moving, right? So if I clicked on here while it was frozen and then started moving it, say to right here, and then it shows my new circle, right? That would be great, you know, because then I'd be like, okay, that's the circle that I want. I'm gonna move it there, and if it's not, then I'll just, you know, move it over here, and then it's gonna show me my new circle. That would be awesome, and it would just be nice if we could have that element of control there, because it doesn't feel like we have one at the moment. The other thing is this varied speed of the pendulum. The speed of the pendulum feels like it's physics based, but it's not, because the pendulum moves in a circle as opposed to like a U pattern or something. When we move the pendulum, it feels like it's reacting to gravity. So for example, right here, you can see that I'm gonna move the pendulum right there, and that really looks like it's responding to gravity because of how fast it falls. And so when I move the pendulum just like upward, if I want it to go up, then it starts moving really slow upward. And again, it feels like it's gravity based because it does accelerate faster when going downward. Upward it goes slower. I'm trying to figure out why that is, because if the pendulums just keep moving in circles, and there's no reason why it should, you know, accelerate going down and decelerate going up. It's really strange to me because it feels like, again, it's another element of control that I don't have. Now, when you play the game a lot and you start reading these little cues here and there, it does work. It's just, it feels like you're fighting against it. And then again, you have that ceiling that you get to, where you have so many pendulums, for example, right here, where I just have a bunch of pendulums and I don't feel like I can ever get away from those random spawning enemies fast enough. So all in all, it's a interesting idea. I would like to see it more well-rounded design, more thinking about the purpose of what it is that you're trying to do here. Thank you, Breadfast T, for submitting this game, and I hope that I could help. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you another time. Oh, check this out, watch. Ready for this? Boom, I'm gone. See you guys later.